Good afternoon. My name is Joni Bryan, and I'm a storyteller alchemist. Today, I want to talk to you about story alchemy, leveraging the power of our story to heal, resist, and transform. I want to start by telling you a story. The first time I fell in love, it was with a little girl. I was 9 years old, and she looked about my age. She lived on the other side of the world in a place I could only imagine in pieces from grainy photographs with blurry backgrounds. Her bare feet were covered with sand. Her eyes told stories of a life that had been much more challenging than my own. She did not have a backpack or books for school, and sometimes she walked a mile or more to get water for her family. I learned that for $1 a day, I could help her. She could have books and a backpack, she could attend school, and wear shoes on her long walk to get water. While $1 a day was more than my allowance would cover, I enlisted the help of grown-ups to change her world. The first time I fell in love, it was with a story of a life different than mine, but a life I could touch. I fell in love with the idea that a story could change the future world as she and I experienced it. Our stories are precious. Whether they're stories of triumphs, suffering, or dreams, our stories tell us of the world as it was and the world as it could be. Our stories hold our struggles, they frame our purpose, and above all, they are deeply personal, bits of our essence wrapped up in words and memories. The ancients recognized the importance of stories and the power of stories to change the future. Norse tradition depicted the Norns as three sisters who weaved the story of the past and future into a tapestry. In Norse and other ancient traditions, the weavers of the past and future could be called upon to help in times of need. Ancient people offered prayers of supplication to the weavers of fate, often asking for the story to change, asking for a new story for the future. Priests and priestesses recognized their role in creation to interpret and remember the tapestry already woven, to tell the story of how it came to be, and to guide the weaver's hands as they wove the future. For the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual communities, collectively referred to herein as the LGBTQIA community or the queer community, our stories have not always been bright threads in a shared tapestry. They have been shrouded and dulled to protect the main characters. They've been hidden in code, told in hushed tones over drinks in a bar where another patron overhearing might be the reason we don't go home. They are passed through channels carved from tears and suffering, reframed and retold in palatable format for the general public, and lost in bits and pieces along the way. Even naming ourselves has been a journey of transgression. The names chosen for our own often overwritten and repurposed. Instead, new names created in hateful tongues used as slurs and insults in local dialects find their way like arrows into our soul. Narratives told about us become our history, and our authentic story lost amongst the words of a society that oppresses us. But what if we reclaimed our story and the words to construct it, as we reclaimed the once powerful words of aggression and ridicule aimed at our community, like queer and gay? What if we were each alchemists of our own narrative, making gold from the heavy burden of lead? Within this article and literature review and this presentation, I explore research findings framing the efficacy of storytelling in the queer community as an act of resistance and healing for wounds resulting from the trauma of being forcibly silenced and erased. Utilizing our story and narrative as an act of resistance and healing involves three distinct aspects: critically re-examining the stories we have believed about ourselves and our role in a society, reframing those stories to represent our authentic narrative, and reclaiming our story in all its beautiful imperfection. The story historically told of the LGBTQIA community reads like a horror novel, fraught with judgment and criticism, violence and bloodshed, fear and loathing, silence and pain. The LGBTQIA story has been weaponized against us. It has been ingrained in our societal learning from birth, targeting queer people as social pariahs. Even those raised in tolerant households have not been exempt from experiencing intolerance and distrust. This societal oppression has imposed deep-seated trauma upon the queer community, many of us unconsciously assimilating this narrative into our own story. Assimilation of this story results in queer cognitive dissonance between learned social expectations and being our authentic self. This splitting of our thoughts causes an internal war between our human desire to be worthy of love and belonging and our human desire to show ourselves fully and authentically. Often, this cognitive dissonance results in internal loathing and self-hatred for who we are and what we desire. Stepping outside of the story we've been told and looking at it from an objective perspective, picking apart what is true and what is unfounded, is part of re-examining the story we've been told. In this process, it's important to find our own truth. In re-examining the story, we take back our power, effectively saying, this story may not be my truth. My truth is my own, and I will reject what doesn't serve my highest good. This practice is powerful, both spiritually and emotionally, as well as mentally. Re-examining our story looks like asking ourselves 3 basic questions. What is my story? What have I been told about being queer from my family, my friends, and the world around me? What do I believe about being queer? Sometimes it helps to remove ourselves entirely from this question and instead focus on others in the queer community. In identifying the messages and naming them, we are able to then examine them from a more objective perspective, allowing us to determine for ourselves whether these stories are accurate representations of who we are or whether they should be revised before we own them. These questions and the critical analysis of our answers to them provide an opportunity to reframe the story we've assimilated into our existence and worldview. Trauma resulting from believing a false narrative begins to be exposed in this exercise. For example, I was raised in a fundamentalist Christian household. I was told from a young age that God despises queer people, that being queer was a sin, that there was something fundamentally wrong with queer humans. I understood how the media portrayed queer people, that being queer resulted in broken relationships, self-loathing, sickness, and death. I understood from my hometown when the single queer person I knew growing up was shot and killed that being queer was dangerous. I learned from his parents when they covered up his murder that being queer was shameful. I learned from school that queer history didn't exist and that it wasn't important enough to teach. And I incorporated these messages into my worldview and in the way I conducted myself. I loathed my queerness instead attempting to change myself to fit the expectations of society. Although I knew I was born differently than heterosexual cisgender individuals, I believed there must be some mistake, a defect of some sort that should be hidden and overcome in order to be a productive member of society. As an adult, I was able to name these stories I was told. I gave myself permission to question their validity, and in doing so, I began to answer the question, what is my story? Reframing our story begins with asking the questions, what is my true, authentic story? Sometimes the stories we've been told or the stories we have told ourselves do not reflect our truth and authenticity. Reframing our story allows us to take back the narrative and moves us toward reclaiming our story from a position of power. Particularly in the queer narrative, our stories do not often take place in where we are in a position of power. We are not read as the creatrix or hero, but rather as the victim. When we have reframed our story to reflect our own understanding of our experiences in the world and discarded baseless judgments upon our existence, we begin to take back our role as the storyteller in our own life. Naming ourselves is part of that reclamation. The term queer was originally a pejorative term meant to degrade and demean LGBTQIA individuals. In recent years, the queer community has reclaimed and repurposed the word, staking our claim on hard-won ground and using the word as an oppositional social location, speaking to the inadequacy of heteronormative culture and building a social construct around sexuality and gender. Reclaiming our story means assuming the role of storyteller in our own narrative. Reclaiming our story means exiting the closet we have sometimes been forced into, stepping into the light as our authentic self. Reclaiming our story means to take back the words used to negotiate our existence and actively choosing the words we use to define ourselves and describe our history. Reclaiming our story also means becoming an active participant in our own wild lore. Reclaiming our story takes place in an oppositional social location, a space where our truth has not existed before, and a space where our truth is tantamount to freedom. It is not without risk. We must be willing to face down the status quo. We must be willing to relinquish our role of victim. We must be willing to change societal norms and willing to see our own role in societal oppression and injustice. This takes courage. Though our voice may quaver in the telling our story can heal the trauma of having our narrative defined by a dominant culture. But telling our story also means facing that trauma. One of the most damning aspects of trauma is the isolation and separation resulting from the shame associated with it. Reclaiming our stories gives us the opportunity to reject shame, and in so doing, creates human connection. Human connection displaces shame resulting from feeling alone and unaccepted with the knowledge of commonality in the human experience. Connection also restores our ability to navigate stressors in our lives resulting from societal oppression, injustice, and abuse. Authentic human connection bolsters our power, providing us with both a sounding board and a compassionate platform from which to continue telling our story. Telling our story authentically and showing up as ourselves in the world provides us with the singular opportunity to overcome spiritual and human impoverishment, to build a lore and a history on a shared social landscape, and to validate the unique beauty of our own journey. In re-examining our story, we give ourselves permission to believe an alternate narrative. In reframing our story, we position ourselves as the hero and the healer in our own epic saga. In reclaiming our story, we walk into our power, providing a space for healing and an example for others to follow. And in owning our story, we effectively change not only our world, but the world around us. We also change the future. Frederick Buechner said in his book, Telling Secrets, "My story is important, not because it is mine, God knows, but because if I tell it anything like right, the chances are you will recognize that in many ways it is also yours. If this is true, it means that to lose track of our stories is to be profoundly impoverished, not only humanly, but also spiritually." Thank you.